Joining me now on Waterloo Live is Clare Siviter, Senior Lecturer in French Theatre and Performance at the University of Bristol. Clare, welcome. It's great to see you. Give us a sense of Napoleon's life in Elba during 1814-15 and how that leads to him making the decision to come back to France in March 1815.
So Napoleon's life in Elba is dictated in some ways about the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and I just want to talk about that very briefly. So it was signed on the 11th of April, and it's Alexander I of Russia who decides that Napoleon is going to go to Elba. The rest of the Allied heads of state aren't consulted, so they're fairly annoyed to know that Napoleon is ending up on this Mediterranean island rather close to a coast. Napoleon is taken down from Fontainebleau. He says goodbye to his guard. It's part of kind of the Napoleonic legend. You know, he kisses his the eagles 3 times. It's all very theatrical. But then it's also a little bit of a rain check, because as Napoleon heads south, he realizes that he is not quite as popular as maybe he thought he was. So that's really quite interesting. And then he is taken to Elba, lands 2 weeks later on the 4th of May. And there's all this interest in this fallen emperor. So Elba, it has to be said, a few months previously, hadn't been particularly keen on being part of the French Empire. They'd been revolting and things like that, but all of a sudden to have Napoleon here, it was kind of this object of curiosity. And initially he moves into the first floor of the town hall, and people are kind of like, who is this? They come to see him. And then he moves up to the Villa Mulini and tries to create kind of like the sense of something, not a court, but something more fitting for a defeated emperor. He's allowed to keep the title emperor. He has a small number of soldiers who go with him. So there's 700 members of the guard. More than 100 soldiers come from Poland as well to accompany him. And he creates this mini empire. He busies himself with building projects, agricultural projects. And we know from his daily rhythm that he keeps this intensity up, you know, rising at 4, reading, administration, riding, lots of baths, lots of naps as well, but going out in the afternoons, meeting people. And we start to get this tourist trade as well, people coming to Elba to meet Napoleon. So again, kind of object of curiosity for the locals, like the 12,000 inhabitants, and for the people who then come to Elba. And there are several things that really annoy him, apart from no longer being Emperor of the French. That's probably number 1. Number 2 is that Marie-Louise and his son don't join him. So he thought that his wife and son would join him. He thought that's where they should be, but that's not happening. Marie-Louise is the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, so he has other plans. And then Louis XVIII doesn't pay him what he's due under the terms and conditions of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. And then, to make matters worse, he then seizes his personal possessions in France. So Napoleon is really not very happy. On top of that, there are rumours going both ways. Rumours that by December 1814 that Napoleon is looking to escape Elba, and rumours that the Allies might move him. So it's thinking about what's the opportune, if you're Napoleon, thinking about what's the opportune time to make that leap across the coast and set sail. And this happens eventually. In early February, he confides in his nearest and dearest and says, look, this is what I'm aiming to do. And at the end of February, Campbell leaves for Italy for a while. And that's kind of like the opportune moment for Napoleon to escape, because the English forces aren't being as vigilant as they perhaps should. And it creates this fantastic opportunity for him to be like, right, it's now or never.
So how do the public react to news of Napoleon's return? I mean, you mentioned there, as he's travelling south, he realises he's not quite as popular as he thought he might be. There's a lot of debate about the idea that Napoleon's return is basically a military coup, something that I would personally agree with, but I know others disagree. What's your take on the whole situation?
So France in 1814, 1815 is in this, I mean, clearly it's in the middle of a massive transformation, but with the return of the monarchy, people aren't quite so sure. So Louis XVIII arrives back, and one of the problems is he's always been used to kind of like this royal idea of France. Like, he's aware of what's happened in the revolution, very obviously, but he still thinks that he ought to be able to rule as this monarch of the divine right. And one of the sticking points is this idea of the Charter of 1814, the idea that France have a constitution, that he should be kind of like held to account slightly, that clashes with his idea of what it means to be a monarch. And we need to remember as well, in terms of PR, he's not exactly the person you would have chosen to be king, if that were possible. He's at the end of the 1780s, he's rumored to be sleeping with Marie Antoinette. He's kind of like this hedonist prince, and he can be, because he's number two. He's number two for a lot of his lifetime. So I think that transition to all of a sudden becoming number one is really difficult for him. So that's the background of what's going on in France. So Napoleon, as I said, on the way down, realizes that not everyone loves him. And when he comes back, he lands in Gauchois, and he's kind of like plotted this route with some of his close advisors, basically to go along the coast up into the foothills of the Alps and then into Grenoble, where apparently the inhabitants are so overjoyed to see him that they tear down the city gates. We can see kind of some of the legend coming in here, but it is really interesting that Napoleon doesn't go straight up, that he does make this very calculated geographical return to France. But of course, rumors start to spread, and we can see throughout France people celebrating the return of Napoleon, and others very annoyed about it. When he gets to Lyon, again, he is greeted as this revolutionary hero, and I think for him that's one of the first times he realizes how much he can play on this revolutionary legacy. People are apparently overjoyed to see the return of the tricolour over the white flag that the monarchy had imposed. And so we can see within Napoleon this kind of like recalculation of being like, right, this is how I'm going to get my political support. Eventually he makes his way up to Paris. At the same time, not all areas of France are overjoyed to see him. So one of the key examples of this is Bordeaux, where the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who was the oldest surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, heads down and tries to kind of hold off the Napoleonic forces. And she manages to do so within the city until early April. But that kind of like stays very much part of the city's narrative. Even to this day, you can see it in the local art gallery. So not everyone's overjoyed. In terms of the question of whether it's a military coup, I mean, Napoleon returns through the military. The military had been neglected slightly, especially the veterans, by the Restoration government. So that's how he makes his way back up. At the same time, it was only possible because the Restoration government was fairly inept. They weren't good at PR, as I've already mentioned. They weren't particularly good at bureaucracy, at kind of ingraining a strong hold over the country. And they didn't take the rumours that Napoleon might escape properly. So had they done that, perhaps he may only have got to Grenoble, say, and then there would have been this face-off. But the fact kind of they don't try and fight, the fact they kind of then flee as well, we can see that it's half a dozen of one and six of the other.
Absolutely. What do we know about Napoleon's mood in the run-up to the 1815 campaign? Because there's a strong sense that he's not quite himself for a lot of it.
I think Napoleon's mood changes if you look at the history of his life quite dramatically. I think, if you took any 2-year periods and compared them, it wouldn't be the same. But within this 1815 context, there are several things at play. One, he's still really annoyed about 1814. I think that's really important to underline, the sense of, he had been so great, but he lost it all. We speak today about trauma within kind of public discourse. And I think that you can see elements of that there in the way that Napoleon handles the situations in 1814. He, again, like Louis XVIII, had issues with how to govern France. They weren't quite so stark as for Louis XVIII, but whereas Louis XVIII had to kind of rethink his royal power, Napoleon also has to rethink his imperial power. So one of the places where we see this really coming to the fore is the Additional Act of 1815, which is put together by Benjamin Constant, and is much more liberal in terms of how France should be governed than it was beforehand. And as Louis XVIII struggled with the charter, Napoleon struggles with the Act Additionnel, and we see him, even the celebration for it on the 1st of June doesn't go to plan. It's too hot. It's kind of the crowds don't react quite as they're meant to. So we can see him double guessing everything as he goes through. Thirdly, Marie-Louise and his son still aren't there. I think that emotionally plays a big part in how he sees the world. He's also spent a lot of time creating this hereditary empire. So to not have his son there, I think really does, he does struggle with it. Everyone knows war is coming. How far can you put that off? What does it mean? What are the allies going to do? He had worked with some of these people, created treaties with them. They've obviously then turned against him. And I think that starts to play with his mind. And I think there is a sense of paranoia as well. There are so many spies around. There are so many kind of rumors going around. Whereas in the past, he could take swift action. Now he doesn't know what to do in some senses. And then there's this question of, is he ill? Which historians have treated. So Philip Dwyer, for one, talks about him having severe anxiety. So again, kind of like this emperor who always used to be able to take decisive action, read the reports, we're going to do this, X, Y, and Z. He's no longer able to do that in quite the same way. Then Thierry Lance thinks that he might have hemorrhoids or a urine infection. And again, kind of like that puts him in agony. So that again changes his decision making. Can we know? Not entirely. We can speculate, and that's what we do. That's what our job is to do, to try and understand why he makes some of those decisions. But yeah, over 200 years ago, so it's quite difficult.
I just want to talk about legacy, if we may, in the couple of minutes we've got left. This is a horrible question. How do you sum up Napoleon's legacy in under 3 minutes? He is a dominant figure of the era, hugely successful for much of his life, but he also comes with his controversies, with his reforms, with his methods. How would you try and sort of soundbite, if you will, Napoleon?
He's a singular individual at a singular moment of time. I think you have to say that nothing he achieves would have been possible 10 years previously, 10 years later. It's only because of the revolution that Napoleon can rise through the ranks so quickly, that he can take charge of that situation in the Directory as well, and then Brumaire. And I think whatever you think of him, you have to respect the amount he achieves in so little time. There are very few other examples in history of one individual managing to achieve so much. Have I got time to talk for a little bit longer or not?
Oh, go for it.
Okay, so Napoleonic legend, it excites me a lot. I find it really interesting. So we can see him crafting this image of himself throughout his reign, even beforehand. I've been working on some of the censorship reports of the Directory recently, and we can see people wanting to write plays about him, and then the censors being like, but he's still alive, so we need to double check that with him. And then, Annie Jourdain has looked a lot what happens during his reign as well, how he crafts that image. But one of the things that really strikes me is Nathalie Petitou's idea of the Légende Rose and the Légende Noire, so kind of like the pink or rosy legend, which very much kind of is kept alive by the veterans, by the publication of the memorial, and then this Légende Noire that's kind of like, and we're constantly switching in between the two. I think more recently, especially following 2021 and the bicentenary of his death, some of those debates have come back. There's definitely dark sides. You've spoken about, the methods, the cost, etc. There's also the rise of nationalism during the Napoleonic Empire outside of France as well. And we see what happens to that, kind of like the very dark side of it at the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries. There are his views on women, which multiple people have approached him for. And then there's also his reintroduction of slavery in 1802 to the territories that were handed back with the Treaty of Amiens. And I think that's really important to integrate. And we can see that this anti-Napoleon or counter discourse being modified as time goes by, more things are being included, and I think that gives us a better idea. Having said that, the Code Civil, the kind of legal text that founds modern France, that allows other countries to have religious tolerance, that's then used as a model for in Latin America, for example, that's really important. The baccalaureate, the French equivalent of A-levels, are still going, the central bank. So it's this, it's a great essay question. But there is this constant, you can look at it in different ways, and it's this constant balance. And he is a very complex individual.
He certainly is. And it's a debate that will last at least another 200 years, I'm sure. Clare Siviter, Senior Lecturer in French Theatre and Performance at the University of Bristol. Thank you for joining us here on Waterloo Live.